You might see a small, slightly bruised berry hanging from a bush and think nothing of it. It's a tiny, mundane detail in a vast landscape, sitting there fermenting in the sun while the rest of the world goes about the brutal business of survival. But for an ancient human, that single overripe fruit wasn't just a snack, it was a choice. They didn't just stumble into altered states of consciousness by accident. They sought them out with a dedication that borders on the obsessive. We often imagine our ancestors as grim, stoic figures entirely consumed by the hunt, but the archaeological record tells a much stranger story. It suggests that for as long as we have been human, and perhaps even longer, we have been looking for ways to scramble our own circuits. This isn't a story about modern escapism or a history of vice. It is a deep-time investigation into why the human brain seems to have a built-in open sign for psychoactive substances. We're going to look at the evidence, from the Neolithic poppy fields of Spain to the psychedelic cave murals of the Sahara, to understand a simple, haunting truth. Ancient humans didn't just get high occasionally. For many, it was a fundamental part of the daily rhythm of life. And as it turns out, that bruised berry was just the beginning of a journey that would eventually rewrite the history of our species. To understand why we do this, we have to go back way before the first city was ever built, back to a time when we weren't even fully human yet. Millions of years ago, our primate ancestors were already living in a world saturated with natural chemicals. There's a fascinating theory in evolutionary biology involving the ADH4 gene, which, interestingly enough, is the reason you can handle a glass of wine without immediately passing out. That suggests our ability to metabolize ethanol evolved about 10 million years ago. This happened right around the time our ancestors transitioned from living in trees to spending more time on the forest floor. Down there, they found fallen fruit. This fruit wasn't fresh. It was fermenting, turning sugar into alcohol. The primates who could eat this boozy fruit without getting too sick or too uncoordinated to escape a predator had a massive caloric advantage. They were getting extra energy from a source their competitors couldn't touch. Over millions of years, this wasn't just a dietary quirk, it became an evolutionary nudge. We didn't just learn to tolerate these substances, we evolved a brain that was primed to seek out the reward they provided. By the time we were walking upright and sharpening flint, the biological hardware for intoxication was already installed and humming in the background. Moving forward into the Paleolithic, roughly 40,000 years ago, we see the first hints that this wasn't just about calories anymore, it was about the mind itself. In the Tassili Niger plateau of the Algerian Sahara, there are cave paintings that date back thousands of years, and one image in particular has haunted researchers for decades. It's known as the bee-man. It depicts a figure with a human body and a bee-like head, covered in sprouting mushrooms. Some ethnomycologists, most notably the late Giorgio Samorini, argue that this is a direct depiction of the use of psilocybin mushrooms. The mushrooms aren't just in his hands. They are growing out of his skin, suggesting a complete merging of the self with the substance. This wasn't a casual doodle. It was a sacred record. By the way, if you've ever wondered why so many ancient cultures have legends about talking plants, this is likely where those stories were born. These early humans were discovering that certain fungi didn't just fill their bellies, they dissolved the walls of their reality. They were using these substances to navigate the invisible world of spirits and ancestors, making the high a vital bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. As we transition into the Neolithic Revolution around 10,000 years ago, the scale of substance use changes dramatically because humans started to control their environment. This is where the story gets really interesting and a bit controversial. For a long time, historians assumed we started farming grain because we wanted to make bread. It's the logical, hungry human explanation. But a growing number of archaeologists, including Patrick McGovern from the University of Pennsylvania, suggest that the real driver might have been beer. Bread is fine, but beer provided something more. It provided a way to bond a community and create a shared ritualized experience. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, researchers found massive stone troughs that could hold up to 40 gallons of liquid. Chemical analysis showed traces of calcium oxalate, a byproduct of grain fermentation. These people weren't just farming, they were throwing massive alcohol-fueled festivals long before they ever built a permanent house. The desire to get altered might have been the very thing that forced us to stop wandering and start building civilizations. Though, if we're being honest, building a temple just to have a place to drink with your friends is a very human motivation. While some were brewing grain in the Middle East, others were cultivating far more potent plants. If we look at the Cueva de los Murciélagos in southern Spain, archaeological excavations led by Elisa Garridose from the University of Valladolid have uncovered something startling. Inside a Neolithic burial site dating back about 6,000 years, they found evidence of the opium poppy. These weren't wild specimens, they were being intentionally used. We see the same thing in the lakeside settlements of Switzerland and Italy from the same era. Opium wasn't just a medicine back then, it was a constant companion. Imagine a world where every toothache, every broken bone, and every long cold winter night was met with the heavy numbing embrace of the poppy. For these people, getting high wasn't a weekend activity. It was the only way to endure the physical reality of a pre-modern life. It was a tool for survival that also happened to offer a doorway to a different state of mind. Now, let's travel further east to the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. By 3000 BCE, substance use had become highly specialized and deeply integrated into the social hierarchy. In Sumerian texts, the opium poppy is referred to as hulgil, which literally translates to the joy plant. They knew exactly what it did. In ancient Egypt, the blue lotus flower became a central motif in art and religion. If you look at the tomb paintings, you'll see the elite of Egypt sniffing these flowers or soaking them in wine. The blue lotus contains apomorphine and nuciferine, which act as mild sedatives and hallucinogens, which, considering the heat of the Nile Delta, probably made the long afternoons a lot more bearable. This wasn't just for pleasure, though. The Egyptians believed the flower was a symbol of the sun and rebirth. By consuming it, they weren't just getting buzzed, they were participating in the cosmic cycle of the gods. The high was a religious requirement, a way to maintain the balance of Ma'at, or cosmic order, in their daily lives. Across the ocean in the Americas, a completely different set of substances was shaping human history. In the Andes Mountains, around 3000 BCE, the inhabitants of what is now Peru were already deeply involved with the San Pedro cactus. This cactus contains mescaline, a powerful psychedelic. At the site of Chavin de Huantar, a massive temple complex, archaeologists found stone carvings of figures transforming into jaguars while holding the San Pedro cactus. The temple itself was designed with a complex series of underground tunnels and acoustic chambers. Researchers believe that initiates would be given the cactus and then led through these dark, roaring tunnels, where the sound of water and the visual distortions of the drug would create a terrifying, life-altering spiritual breakthrough. For the Chavin people, the high wasn't something you did for fun. It was a traumatic, beautiful, and necessary rebirth that turned a person into a member of the community. It was a daily reality for the priests and a periodic, world-shaking event for the common people. In the same region, we find the ubiquitous coca leaf. While we associate it today with refined chemicals, for thousands of years it was simply a leaf chewed with a bit of lime. In 2010, researchers found coca leaves in the hair of 3,000-year-old mummies in the Azapa Valley. For the people living in the thin air of the Andes, coca was a physiological necessity. It warded off altitude sickness, suppressed hunger, and provided a steady stream of energy for grueling labor. It was so central to their existence that it was used as currency and as a sacred offering. To these people, the idea of not being under the influence of the leaf would have seemed insane. Why would you choose to be tired, hungry, and sick when the earth provided a leaf that made you feel capable and strong? The high here wasn't a distraction from work, it was the fuel for it. As we move toward the classical era, roughly 1000 BCE to 500 CE, we see the emergence of the most famous and mysterious substances of all, the kykeon of Greece and the soma of ancient India. The Eleusinian mysteries were secret rites held annually in honor of Demeter and Persephone. For nearly 2,000 years, the greatest minds of the ancient world, Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, traveled to Eleusis to drink a potion called kykeon. They emerged from the darkness of the Telesterion, claiming they were no longer afraid of death. While the exact recipe was a state secret, many modern scholars, such as Brian Murarescu, author of *The Divine Spark*, suggest the drink was spiked with ergot, a fungus that grows on barley and contains precursors to LSD. By the way, if you think it's a coincidence that the foundation of Western philosophy was built by people who had just had a massive psychedelic experience, you might want to look closer at their texts. For the Greeks, this wasn't a daily high, but it was the defining high of their lives, the experience that gave their entire culture its spiritual depth. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley and beyond, the authors of the Rig Veda were composing hymns to a substance called soma. They described it as a plant that was pressed to produce a juice that brought divine inspiration, health, and a feeling of immortality. We have drunk the soma, we have become immortal. We have gone to the light, we have found the gods, one hymn proclaims. The identity of soma is one of history's greatest mysteries. Was it a mushroom like Amanita muscaria *, a stimulant like ephedra, or something else entirely? Whatever it was, the Vedas make it clear that the substance was not just a drug, it was a deity in its own right. The ritual of preparing and drinking it was the central axis around which their entire religious life revolved. It wasn't just about getting high, it was about consuming the divine essence to keep the world turning. So we have to stop and ask, why? Why did every single branch of the human family tree, from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the humid jungles of the Amazon, find a way to alter their consciousness? When you look at the sheer breadth of the evidence, the 5,000-year-old cannabis seeds found in the Pamir Mountains, the tobacco and coca and Egyptian mummies that still baffles archaeologists, the fermented honey mead of the early Germanic tribes, it becomes clear that being sober might be the historical anomaly, not the other way around, which parenthetically makes our modern war on drugs look like a very strange brief blip in a 40,000-year history of chemical exploration. We have to consider that maybe our ancestors weren't just looking for pleasure or trying to escape a hard life. Maybe they were using these substances as tools for a very specific kind of mental work. Recent neuroscience might actually give us the answer. When we use many of these substances, particularly psychedelics and even low doses of alcohol, it affects what's called the default mode network in the brain. This is the part of your brain responsible for your sense of self, for rumination, and for the rigid categories we use to organize the world. By dampening this network, these substances allow the brain to make new, chaotic, and often brilliant connections. For an ancient human, this scrambling could have been a massive survival advantage. It allowed for creative problem solving. It fostered intense social bonding through shared experience, and it provided a way to process the overwhelming trauma of life in the wild. The high wasn't a bug in the human system, it was a feature. It was a pressure valve, and a creative engine all rolled into one. They got high every day because, in a world where everything was trying to kill you, the ability to see the world differently was the most valuable tool they had. Think about the village shaman, a figure found in almost every ancient culture. This person was the doctor, the historian, and the spiritual guide. And almost universally, they used psychoactive plants to do their job. In the Amazon, it was ayahuasca. In Siberia, the fly agaric mushroom. In North America, peyote. These weren't people partying in the modern sense. They were specialists performing a dangerous, necessary service. They would enter an altered state to travel to the source of a disease or to negotiate with the spirits of the animals they hunted. To the rest of the tribe, the shaman's ability to get high was the only thing keeping the community safe from the invisible forces of the world. The high was a professional requirement, a burden of office that the entire community relied on. And then there's the mundane reality of the average person's life. If you were a farmer in the Neolithic, your life was defined by repetitive, back-breaking labor. Your diet was limited, your body was likely riddled with parasites, and you lived in constant fear of crop failure or raid. In that context, a daily dose of weak beer or a few poppy seeds wasn't a luxury. It was a form of psychological maintenance. It made the unbearable bearable. It provided a small window of warmth and relaxation at the end of a 14-hour day. We tend to judge ancient drug use through the lens of modern addiction, but for most of history, these substances were used in highly regulated, ritualized ways. They were integrated into the fabric of society so deeply that they were almost invisible. It wasn't a problem to be solved, it was the solution to the problem of being alive. The further we look back, the more we realize that the human story is inextricably linked to the plants and fungi we consumed. We didn't just domesticate wheat and barley. They domesticated us, often by offering us a way to change how we felt. The great monuments of the ancient world, the pyramids, the ziggurats, the Stonehenge megaliths were built by people whose minds were regularly swimming in substances we now label as dangerous or illicit. It raises a haunting question. Would we even have a civilization if we hadn't been perpetually buzzed? Would we have had the audacity to build cities, to invent writing, or to track the stars if we hadn't first seen those patterns in a chemically induced trance? The evidence suggests that the rational human mind is only half the story. The other half is the mind that seeks to transcend itself, to break out of the cage of the ego and touch something larger. As the centuries rolled on and we entered the modern era, we began to compartmentalize these experiences. We moved the high from the center of the temple to the margins of society. We started to treat consciousness as something that should be stable, productive, and uniform. But our biology hasn't changed. We still have that 10-million-year-old ADH4 gene. We still have a default mode network that occasionally needs to be shut down. We are still the descendants of the people who sat in those Saharan caves, painting mushrooms on their skin. We are the children of the poppy farmers and the beer brewers. Our history isn't just written in stone and ink. It's written in the chemical receptors of our brains. We have always been a species that refused to accept reality as it was given to us. We have always been looking for a way to turn the mundane into the miraculous. When you look at the broad sweep of this chronological journey, a clear pattern emerges. Every time humans encountered a new environment, they found the local shortcut to an altered state. In the Arctic, it was the lichen. In the desert, it was the cactus. In the forest, it was the mold on the grain. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a search. We were looking for the keys to our own minds, trying to find the buttons that would trigger awe, connection, and relief. And we found them, over and over again, in every corner of the globe. This realization changes how we look at our ancestors. They weren't primitive because they used drugs. They were sophisticated because they understood that the human mind is a flexible, vast territory that shouldn't be limited to a single state of being. They knew something we have largely forgotten, that the perspective you have while sober is just one of many, and not necessarily the most important one. So let's go back to that physical detail from the beginning, that bruised, fermenting berry on the bush. Think about the first person who stopped to pick it up. They weren't just a hungry animal looking for a meal. They were a pioneer, standing on the edge of the greatest frontier in the universe, the human consciousness. When they ate that berry and felt the first strange shift in their perception, they weren't just getting high. They were opening a door that would never be closed again. They were initiating a 40,000-year experiment in what it means to be more than just a biological machine. They were choosing to be human, with all the beauty, chaos, and danger that comes with a mind that can go anywhere it wants, which, when you think about it, is a pretty heavy legacy for a piece of rotten fruit. That bruised berry, with its sweet, sharp smell of fermentation, is the exact point where our history began to diverge from the rest of the animal kingdom. Other creatures might get drunk by accident, but only we turned it into a culture. Only we turned it into a god. We have spent thousands of years refining that first accidental buzz into the complex, often troubled relationship we have with substances today. But the underlying drive remains the same. We are still that person standing by the bush, looking at the fruit and wondering what's on the other side. We are still searching for the joy plant, the divine spark, and the light of the gods. We are still trying to find a way to make the mundane world feel like it's enough. But here is the chilling, definitive truth that the archaeological record leaves us with. That person 10,000 years ago wasn't reaching for the berry because they were bored, and they weren't reaching for it because they were weak. They were reaching for it because they realized that the human brain in its natural state is an incomplete tool. It is a cage of survival, a narrow window into a much larger reality. They got high every day because they knew that without those substances, they were blind to the most important parts of their own existence. They didn't use drugs to escape reality. They used them to survive it. And as you look at that small bruised fruit in your mind's eye, ask yourself this: if our entire civilization, our religions, our philosophies, and our very sense of self were built on a foundation of altered states, what does that say about who we are when we're sober? Are we finally seeing the world clearly, or have we just lost the one tool that used to make us whole? That berry wasn't a snack, it was a confession. We have never been satisfied with being just human. We have always wanted to be more, and the high wasn't the exception, it was the rule. If this deep time journey through the altered states of our ancestors has changed how you look at human history, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is there a particular ancient ritual or substance that you find most fascinating, or do you think the beer before bread theory holds water? Drop a comment below and let's start a conversation about the parts of our history that often get left out of the textbooks. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden corners of the human story with us, please consider subscribing. We've got many more rabbit holes to dive into, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. Until next time, keep looking closer at those mundane details. You never know which one might be a doorway to another world.